It was one of those lazy Saturdays where the house felt super calm, like it was taking slow breaths all by itself. But then a surprise visitor showed up and changed everything in a quiet way I never saw coming. My husband Carl had gone out to run errands, something about picking up mulch for the garden and a few odds and ends at Home Depot. I didn't ask too many questions. I just knew he'd be gone for at least a couple of hours. The house was unusually quiet, save for the hum of the television in the living room. I'd settled into the couch in my cozy robe, cup of peppermint tea in hand, flipping through old sitcom reruns, the kind of shows that wrapped you in a warm blanket of nostalgia without demanding too much attention. I wasn't expecting company. Certainly not him. I heard the door open, didn't think much of it at first, assuming it was Carl. But when I turned my head, I saw Mark. Mark, my husband's longtime friend from work. He was about Carl's age, maybe a couple of years younger, early 60s, with a salt and pepper beard, and those deep lines around his eyes that always looked like they were mid-laugh. He and Carl had worked together for over 2 decades, and they'd stayed close even after Mark retired last year. "Hey, Janine," he said, stepping into the room like he belonged there. "Carl around." I blinked, sitting up a little. "No, he just left." "Didn't he tell you?" Mark shook his head, chuckling. "Nope. He just said he'd be home most of the day. I was driving by and figured I'd swing in, say hello." He shrugged off his jacket, hung it over the arm of the chair, and lowered himself onto the couch right next to me. It wasn't strange at first. We'd all shared this couch dozens of times over. Coffee or a football game, but today I don't know. There was something different. The closeness felt amplified. The quiet of the house, the afternoon light slanting in through the window blinds, the warmth of the tea still cupped in my palms. He looked at the TV and smiled. "Brady Bunch rerun. Didn't take you for a Marsha fan." I laughed maybe too quickly. "It's just background noise." I wasn't really paying attention. He settled back, one arm draped casually over the top of the couch. I felt it. His presence closer than usual, but not uncomfortably so. Just enough that I became very aware of the soft fabric of my robe against my skin, the steam from my tea, the rhythm of my own heartbeat. We talked at first about nothing, about Carl's recent obsession with growing tomatoes, about the new development going up down the road, about the weather which had turned unseasonably warm for early spring. His voice was calm, steady, familiar. But behind his words, I noticed something else. A kind of pause in the way he looked at me when I spoke. A softness in his eyes. "You've changed your hair," he said after a lull in conversation. His voice was gentler now, as though he was stepping into unfamiliar emotional territory. Oh, I ran a hand through it self-consciously. Just a few highlights. Needed something fresh. He smiled again, but this time it lingered. "It suits you. You look really nice today." There was a silence that followed. It wasn't awkward. It was heavy, full, something unspoken stretching out between us like a taut wire waiting to be plucked. I didn't know what to say, so I looked at the television, pretending to be amused by the laugh track that filled the room. But I felt the warmth of him beside me, and something in me shifted. Not outwardly, not visibly, but internally a ripple had started. "You know," he said quietly, "I've always admired how calm you are. Even back when we'd all be at those backyard barbecues and Carl was buzzing around like a madman. You always seemed grounded, like you were the eye of the storm." I turned to face him then, surprised. "You noticed that?" He nodded slowly. I noticed more than people think. There it was again. That pause, that gaze. It wasn't predatory. It wasn't inappropriate. It was thoughtful, deep. It made me feel seen. I had always liked Mark. He had a way of listening that made you feel like your words mattered. But I'd never imagined being alone with him in this kind of stillness, in this kind of shared silence. I looked down at my cup, suddenly realizing it had gone cold. I placed it on the side table, my hand brushing against his as I did. His fingers didn't pull away, neither did mine for a second too long. He looked at me, truly looked at me, and in that gaze I felt the weight of time. The years I had spent being dependable. The years Carl and I had drifted into a quiet, unspoken rhythm. No arguments, no grand passions, just routine. I should probably go, Mark said suddenly, as if the air had become too charged. But he didn't move. I nodded slowly, my heart beating just a little faster now. Probably. Still, we sat there. The sunlight had shifted again, and the room was bathed in gold. I could see the flecks of grey in his beard, the small scar near his temple. I could feel the tension, not the kind that frightened me, but the kind that held potential, uncertainty, possibility. He finally stood, exhaling as though he were releasing something he'd been holding in. "I'll tell Carl I stopped by," he said, glancing back at me. It was nice being here. I walked him to the door, unsure of what any of this meant. But I knew one thing with absolute clarity. Something had changed in that living room. Not loudly, not dramatically, just subtly. But sometimes the quietest moments leave the deepest marks. When the door closed behind him and I returned to the couch, I sat in silence. No TV, no tea, just the soft hum of my thoughts circling around what had passed and what hadn't. And somehow I knew this wasn't the end of it. Later that evening, the house was filled with the familiar sounds of Carl bustling around the kitchen, talking to himself about dinner, while I half listened from the living room. He'd come back with bags of soil, a new set of gardening gloves for me, and 3 kinds of mulch. He insisted were on sale, but premium. He was so proud. His voice animated as he described his plans for redoing the backyard. I nodded, smiled. In the right places, even helped put things away. But part of me was somewhere else. My mind kept circling back to that afternoon, to Mark sitting beside me, the way he had looked at me like I was more than just Carl's wife, the way his fingers had lingered against mine. Nothing had happened, not really. That something had stirred, and once something stirs, it doesn't settle quite the same way again. That night, as Carl snored softly beside me, I stared at the ceiling in the dark, watching the shadows of tree branches sway in the moonlight through the window. I wasn't upset. I wasn't even confused. I was just unsettled, like something dormant inside me had been tapped awake, stretching its limbs and blinking into the light. The next few days went on as usual. Chores, errands, phone calls from the kids. Carl and I had lunch at our usual diner. I met with Donna, my neighbor, for a walk around the block. Normality wrapped itself around me like a well-worn cardigan. And then 3 days later, Mark texted me. "Hey, is Carl home?" Wanted to drop off a set of those old jazz records he was looking for. It was harmless, but the question lingered in my mind. Did he really need to ask if Carl was home, or was it a subtle way of asking if I was? I typed back, "He's out getting a haircut. Should be back in about an hour." A few minutes later, "Mind if I swing by for a sec?" I stared at the message, the soft vibration of the phone in my palms still echoing in my skin. I could have said no. I could have said maybe later, but I didn't. "Sure, come by." Asterisk, I didn't change out of my jeans and simple blouse. I didn't fix my hair or put on lipstick, but I did feel something catch in my chest when I heard the knock. Mark stood at the door holding a dusty stack of vinyl records and a crooked smile. They were buried behind a box of holiday decorations. I figured I'd better get them to Carl before I forget again. I stepped aside to let him in. He'll be happy to see those. He's been talking about that Coltrane album for weeks. He set the records down on the sideboard and looked around. Mind if I stay for a minute? I've been walking around the park all morning. Needed a break. I nodded, gesturing to the living room. Of course, this time he didn't sit right beside me. He took the chair across from the couch. Maybe he was trying to respect the boundary we hadn't spoken about. Maybe he was just being cautious. But his eyes found mine more than once, holding my gaze just a bit longer than they used to. We talked again about ordinary things. But beneath the surface of every sentence there was a subtle awareness. A shift. Like we were both aware of standing at the edge of something we didn't quite have the courage to name. After a pause in conversation, he looked at me with an almost nervous kind of smile. I hope I didn't make you uncomfortable the other day. I wasn't planning on anything. It just felt nice sitting there with you. His words were gentle, tentative. I took a breath, resting my hands in my lap. It didn't make me uncomfortable. It just surprised me. He leaned forward slightly. You ever feel like parts of you get put away for so long? You forget they're there. That question hit me harder than I expected. I nodded slowly. Yes, all the time. Silence stretched between us again, but it wasn't awkward. It was thoughtful. Charged but safe. It felt like two people standing at the edge of a long, quiet lake, knowing they could step in, but not yet deciding whether they should. Mark exhaled. You're easy to talk to, Janine. Always have been. Carl's lucky, you know. I looked down, my voice quiet. Sometimes I wonder if he remembers why. He didn't respond right away, but I saw something shift in his expression. Not pity, just understanding, recognition. He stood then, brushing his palms together. I should let you get on with your day. Just wanted to drop those off. I walked him to the door again, but this time the goodbye was different. There was a hesitation in both of us, like something unspoken was hanging just between us, waiting for the right moment. As he stepped onto the porch, he turned back. Would you ever want to just meet up for coffee sometime? Nothing serious, just two people talking. The way he asked it, so careful, so sincere, stirred something deep inside me. I hesitated, not because I didn't want to, but because I wasn't sure if saying yes would open a door I wasn't ready to walk through. Still, my voice came out softer than I expected. Maybe. He nodded, accepting the answer for what it was. Take care of yourself, Janine. And then he was gone. I closed the door slowly, my fingers resting on the doorknob for a long moment. I stood there listening to the quiet house, feeling the warmth of his words still lingering in the air. It wasn't about romance. Not yet. It wasn't even about temptation. It was about being seen, heard, noticed. And as I returned to the living room, I realized that no matter how ordinary a day might start, a single moment, just one, could change everything you thought you knew about yourself. The week that followed was strangely quiet. Carl was busy with his garden project, digging up patches of the backyard and turning our patio into what he called his Zen zone. He was so focused, so full of purpose, and yet I felt like I was living just slightly outside of my own life, as if watching it from the other side of a window. I moved through my routines with a smile, but underneath something restless stirred. Mark didn't text, didn't call. At first, I thought that maybe it was for the best. Maybe we both sensed the moment had passed, that whatever had hovered in the air between us was fleeting and should be left there. But the silence made it worse. Not hearing from him gave my mind space to wander, to imagine, to replay our conversations. His voice, the way he looked at me like he saw a version of me, I'd long forgotten. Then on Thursday afternoon, I stopped by the local co-op to pick up some lavender hand cream I liked. It was quiet, just me and the cashier, until I turned down the last aisle and nearly bumped into someone. It was Mark. He looked just as surprised as I felt. Maybe more. "Janine," he said, his voice warm. "Quiet. Wasn't expecting to see you here." I smiled, my fingers tightening around the small jar in my hand. I could say the same. There was a pause. We were just standing there in the middle of the aisle between herbal teas and locally made soaps, the scent of patchouli thick in the air. "I was going to text you," he finally said. I wasn't sure if I should. I nodded slowly. "I've been thinking about that day a lot." His shoulders relaxed a little. "Yeah, me too." Neither of us said anything else right away, but he followed me to the checkout, like we both silently agreed that this accidental meeting meant something. Outside, the late afternoon sun was warm, and the trees along the sidewalk swayed gently. In the breeze. "Want to walk a bit?" he asked. I hesitated for only a second. Sure. We walked toward the park. It wasn't far, and the small gravel path that looped around the pond was always quiet at this time of day. Ducks floated lazily on the water, and children's laughter echoed faintly from the nearby playground. It was peaceful and familiar, but there was tension, unspoken, low, and constant. "I keep wondering why that day felt different," I said, finally breaking the silence. Mark glanced at me. "Because it was different. You and we've always had good conversations, Janine. But that day, something shifted, for me at least." I looked down at the path, the sound of our footsteps mingling with the rustle of the wind. In the trees. I felt it too, I admitted, and it scared me a little. He didn't speak for a while, then gently. "Is it because of Carl?" "Yes," I said without hesitation, but not in the way you might think. He stopped walking and I turned to face him. "Carl and we're okay. We've always been okay. But somewhere along the line, we stopped seeing each other. It's like we became roommates who share a house and memories, but not much more. There's comfort in that." "Sure, but comfort can make you forget who you used to be." Mark looked at me with an expression that was hard to read. Part sadness, part empathy. "I never meant to put you in a difficult position," he said quietly. "You're important to Carl, and you've always been someone I admired from afar. But that day on the couch, something felt real, and I haven't been able to stop thinking about it." The breeze picked up slightly, tugging at the ends of my hair. "Neither have I whispered. There was a long silence between us, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was full of things we weren't ready to say out loud. Mark took a careful step forward. "Look, I'm not asking for anything. I don't want to cause problems. I want to be honest with you because for the first time in a long time I felt something true. Not dramatic, not reckless, just true." I didn't know what to say. My heart was racing, and yet I felt strangely calm. It wasn't about an affair. It wasn't about secrets. It was about a connection. A moment of emotional honesty in a life that had become too quiet. We sat on a bench overlooking the pond. The water shimmered in the late sun, and birds hopped across the grass nearby. "Do you ever feel like parts of yourself are still waiting to be discovered?" I asked softly. Mark smiled. "I think we spend our whole lives discovering them." I turned toward him. "So, what do we do with this? With what's growing here?" He didn't answer right away. He just looked out over the pond, then back at me. "We take it one moment at a time. No expectations, no pressure, just honesty. You deserve that." I swallowed hard, feeling the weight of his words settle inside me. It wasn't a solution, but it was real, and somehow that was enough. We walked back in silence, but it was a different kind of quiet than before. Not unsure, just tender, thoughtful. When he dropped me off back at the co-op where I'd parked, he didn't ask to see me again. He didn't need to. We both knew it wasn't the last time. And as I drove home, lavender cream in the bag beside me, and the scent still lingering on my hands, I realized that the road I was on wasn't one I had planned. But it might just be leading me back to a part of myself I thought I'd lost. The days that followed moved with a softness I hadn't felt in years. I carried on like always, cooking dinner, folding laundry, chatting with the neighbors. But something inside me had shifted gently but undeniably. It wasn't just about Mark anymore. It was about what he represented. A mirror, a spark, a quiet reminder that I was still very much here. Carl didn't notice. Or if he did, he didn't say anything. He was so wrapped up in his backyard project, showing me his progress each evening like a proud child with a school project. I nodded, offered compliments, even helped him paint the new bench he built. But all the while, a part of me felt like it was living a parallel life. One foot in the world I'd known for decades, the other towing the edge of something unspoken and new. It wasn't wrong what was happening. At least that's what I kept telling myself. There were no secrets, no betrayal, just connection, thought, reflection. Still, I knew I couldn't live in between forever. Then came the morning I found Mark's note. It wasn't in an envelope, just a single sheet of lined paper folded neatly and tucked into the mailbox beneath a few circulars and a gardening supply catalogue. My name was written in the corner in his clean, slanted handwriting. Janine, I hope you're not upset I left this. I didn't want to call, not because I didn't want to hear your voice, but because I wasn't sure I could say all this aloud without fumbling through it. I meant what I said the other day. All of it. But I also know I can't be a disruption in your life. You deserve clarity, peace, and if there's something in your world that's missing, only you can decide what you need to fill it. That said, I'll be at the lake house this weekend just for a few days. I go there sometimes when I need to clear my head. If you want to talk or just sit by the water, I'll be there. If not, that's okay too. No pressure, no expectation, just honesty always. Mark, I must have read it 5 times before forwarded it back up, holding it tightly in my hand, as if it would tell me what to do next. The lake house. I remembered him mentioning it once years ago, a place he'd inherited from his father in the hills north of town. I could picture it. Old wood floors, big windows, trees rustling all around, a place where everything felt far away. That Saturday, I told Carl I was going to visit a friend out of town. He didn't ask many questions, just kissed me on the cheek and told me to have a good time. The drive was quiet, the road winding through golden fields and sleepy towns. I wasn't even sure I would go through with it until I turned onto the gravel path leading to the cabin. My heart thudded like a drum in my chest, but I didn't turn back. Mark opened the door before I knocked. He looked surprised and not surprised at all. You came, he said softly. I wasn't sure I would, I replied. I wasn't sure you would either. He stepped aside and I walked in. The place smelled like pine and coffee. Sunlight filtered through gauzy curtains. A fire crackled low in the corner. It felt safe. We didn't rush. We didn't fall into anything foolish or impulsive. We just sat, talked, drank tea, walked by the water, letting the breeze speak for us when words felt too heavy. And later, after hours of conversation and long silences and glances that spoke volumes, he reached for my hand. That single gesture, so simple, held everything we had been dancing around. And in that moment, it wasn't about Carl or marriage or what was right or wrong. It was about me, about feeling alive again, present, chosen. We didn't cross any lines that couldn't be uncrossed. There were no whispered confessions under the sheets, no promises, just warmth, proximity, a closeness I hadn't realized I missed. So deeply. The next morning, as I watched the sunrise through the window, I felt something settle inside me. Not confusion, not guilt, but clarity. Mark made breakfast. We didn't say much, and we didn't need to. When it was time to go, he walked me to my car, hands in his pockets, shoulders a little hunched against the morning chill. "Whatever happens next," he said quietly, "I just want you to be happy, Janine. That's all I've ever wanted." I nodded, eyes stinging unexpectedly. "Thank you for reminding me I still get to want things. We didn't kiss. We didn't make plans." I drove home under a soft sky, the road wide and open. Carl was in the yard when I pulled up, kneeling by the flower beds. He looked up and smiled, waving. And in that moment, I didn't feel torn. I didn't feel like a woman caught between two lives. I felt like someone who had finally remembered that her story wasn't over. Whatever choices I made from that day forward, they would come from a place of truth. And that, I realized, was the most unexpected and beautiful thing of